My name is Karen, and I'm 61 years old. I've worked in human resources for nearly 3 decades, most recently at a mid-sized marketing firm in Columbus, Ohio. I've always been the kind of person who kept her head down, did her job well, and tried not to ruffle feathers. Life taught me early on that quiet consistency went a long way. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that evening when my boss, Danielle, invited me to her house. Danielle was in her early 40s, confident, sharp, and effortlessly elegant. She had this way of walking into a room and owning it without saying a word. As a woman a good 20 years her senior, I couldn't help but feel slightly intimidated at first. But over the last year, we developed a surprisingly warm rapport, often chatting over coffee in the break room, laughing about office politics, even exchanging book recommendations. Still, when she invited me over one Thursday afternoon, I assumed it was strictly professional. "I'd love your input on something," she said, standing just outside my office door. "Could you come by my place this weekend? Saturday evening, maybe?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, sure. Of course. Is it about work?" She smiled, a soft, unreadable smile. "In a way. I just think you'll understand what I'm trying to figure out." The cryptic nature of it should have made me wary, but I felt intrigued. Saturday arrived cold and crisp. I remember the sky was painted in that rich winter blue that comes just after sundown. I parked outside her home, a beautifully restored craftsman with ivy crawling up one side, and hesitated for a moment in the car. There was a nervous flutter in my chest, something I couldn't name. I wasn't sure what I expected. Danielle opened the door before I even knocked, as if she'd been waiting just behind it. She was wearing a simple maroon sweater and black slacks, barefoot on the hardwood floors. The scent of mulled wine hung in the air, mixed with something vaguely spicy, maybe clove or sandalwood. "You look wonderful," she said, ushering me inside. I gave a polite laugh and brushed the compliment off. "Thanks, I just threw something on." "No," she said gently, her eyes briefly scanning my face. "You look peaceful, like someone who knows exactly who she is." That comment stuck with me as we settled into her warm, lamplit living room. She poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat across from each other, legs tucked under us like old friends catching up. We chatted for a while, about work, about my garden, about her new kitchen remodel. But then the mood shifted. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, her voice softer now, her wine glass resting against her knee. I nodded, a little unsure. "Have you ever had a moment where you realized you'd been living a version of your life that wasn't really yours? Like you were following all the right steps, doing everything expected, but somewhere along the way, you just forgot to ask yourself if it was what you wanted?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I stared at the rim of my glass, watching the light shimmer through the red liquid. "I think," I said slowly, "I've spent most of my life living in the lines. You know, like a coloring book. No surprises, no mess." Danielle nodded, her expression softening. "And lately," I continued, "I've been wondering what I missed by staying inside those lines." We sat there for a moment, the silence between us not awkward, but full. Like there was something unspoken that we both understood but weren't ready to name. Danielle reached out and gently touched my hand. It wasn't bold or inappropriate. It was grounding, warm, comforting. "You've always seemed so composed at work," she said. "But I see something in you, something curious, alive, like there's a part of you still waiting to be discovered." Her words stirred something in me. not desire, exactly. It was more like recognition. Like someone had seen a version of me I'd forgotten existed. And not only seen it, but named it, honored it. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. I told her about my husband, Mark, who passed away 8 years ago. About how lonely the nights got. About how I sometimes wandered the aisles of grocery stores just to hear human voices. About the fear that I'd quietly disappeared into a routine no one would notice if I vanished from. She listened, not the kind of passive listening people do while waiting to speak, but truly listened, her whole presence attuned. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You haven't disappeared, Karen. You've just been waiting for someone to really look." I felt my throat tighten, and I blinked back tears. Her words weren't romantic or flirtatious. They were human, honest. And I realized in that moment I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Not as a mother or a widow or a manager, but as a woman. The night grew darker outside the window. The wine was long finished, but neither of us seemed eager to move. There was something beautiful about sitting in her home, in this space between friendship and something more undefined. Eventually, I stood to leave. She walked me to the door, her hand grazing my arm. "Thank you for trusting me tonight," she said. I paused before stepping outside. "Thank you for inviting me. I didn't know how much I needed this." As I drove home under the faint hum of streetlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like the turning of a page. I had no idea what the next chapter would bring, but for the first time in a long while, I was willing to find out. The following week at the office passed with a quiet energy between Danielle and me. It wasn't awkward, far from it. It was as if something sacred had happened between us that Saturday night, and now we were both carrying it gently, protecting it from the buzz and bustle of the workday world. Our conversations remained friendly, professional, but there was a deeper layer now. A new awareness. A warmth in her glances, a softness in the way she said my name. I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. Her voice, her calm, the way she looked at me like I mattered in ways that had nothing to do with my resume or department reports. It was confusing, and yet not unwelcome. Friday morning, just as I was finishing my second coffee in the break room, Danielle walked in. She smiled when she saw me, but didn't speak right away. Instead, she poured herself a cup, then leaned against the counter beside me. "Are you doing anything this weekend?" she asked casually. "Not really. Just catching up on laundry and maybe cleaning out the garage," I said with a small chuckle. "Exciting," she teased, then paused. "Want to come by again? I made a stew recipe I want you to try. Nothing fancy. Just company." I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to. I did. But something about the growing connection between us made me feel like I was walking along a shoreline, unsure how deep the water would be once I stepped in. Still, I said yes. Saturday came quickly. I'd brought a bottle of wine this time and even wore my favorite sweater, the one in that mossy green shade that always brought out the hazel in my eyes. I told myself it was just a thoughtful gesture, nothing more. Danielle greeted me at the door again, barefoot once more, this time in soft jeans and a loose white shirt. She looked effortlessly at ease, like someone who had nothing to prove. Her home smelled like rosemary and garlic, something warm and nurturing. Dinner was easy, lighthearted. We talked about silly things, music from the 70s, terrible dates we'd once suffered through, weird office gossip. I laughed more than I had in months. My shoulders felt lighter, like I could finally let go of the weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. After dinner, we settled into her living room again, this time closer together on the couch. I noticed the way our knees almost touched. Neither of us moved away. "You seem different tonight," Danielle said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter. More open." I gave a small shrug. "Maybe I just feel safe here." Her eyes met mine, and something passed between us. Tender, unspoken, steady. She reached for my hand again, but this time didn't let go. "You don't have to explain anything," she said. "I just want you to know. I see you, Karen, and I like what I see." My heart thudded, and I looked away briefly, unsure what to say. I wasn't used to being on the receiving end of something so direct, so genuine. It wasn't about romance, at least not in the traditional sense. It was about connection, recognition. Two souls gently reaching out in a world that often asked women like us to be quiet, to disappear into the background. "I think," I said slowly, "I've spent most of my life waiting for permission. To feel. To want something for myself. I was a good wife, a steady mother, a responsible employee. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to want something just because it made me feel alive." Danielle didn't respond right away. She simply squeezed my hand and leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. We sat like that for a while, silent, connected, still. The crackle of the fireplace the only sound between us. And then she said something I didn't expect. "I invited you over last week because I needed someone who wouldn't judge me, someone who knew the value of quiet truths." "What do you mean?" I asked gently. Danielle sat up, tucking her legs underneath her. Her voice dropped, more hesitant now. "I'd always been drawn to women who carry stories in their silence, women who've lived. And I've spent so long pretending that didn't mean anything to me. But when I talk to you, Karen, I feel like I can finally be honest about who I am." I could feel her vulnerability sitting right there on the table between us, raw and real. And I realized in that moment that she wasn't the only one opening up. "I think I've been waiting for someone to give me that space too," I said quietly. Danielle looked at me, really looked, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't the older woman in the room. I wasn't the widow or the HR manager or the woman who still wore her wedding ring out of habit. I was just me, and she saw that. There was no kiss, no dramatic music swelling in the background. Just two women sitting side by side, breathing in the same quiet truth. As I left her house that night, the wind sharp against my cheeks, I felt something begin to thaw inside me. Not just the loneliness, but the parts of me I had buried beneath duty, years, and loss. I didn't know what was happening between us, but I knew it mattered. And I knew I was finally ready to see where it might lead. The following days unfolded with a strange kind of quiet anticipation. I found myself lingering a little longer at my desk, glancing at the hallway whenever I heard footsteps, half hoping they were hers. Danielle and I kept things professional in the office, but the air between us had shifted, like a familiar melody now carrying new, tender lyrics. It was subtle. A longer glance during meetings, the way her hand would rest on the back of my chair just a second too long, or how our fingers occasionally brushed when passing papers. It wasn't inappropriate. It was private. Ours. And in those fleeting moments, I felt more alive than I had in years. That Friday, as we passed each other near the elevator, she looked at me and said, "Come by tomorrow. I want to show you something." There was no explanation, no details, but I didn't need them. I simply nodded. Saturday came with soft rain, the kind that tapped gently against the windows and made everything outside look slightly blurred and dreamlike. I wore a navy blue blouse and simple silver earrings, things I hadn't reached for in a while. Not because I wanted to impress her, exactly, but because I wanted to feel present, like I was walking into something meaningful, not just another evening. When I arrived, Danielle was in the kitchen, her hair tied back loosely, sleeves rolled. She looked up and smiled. It wasn't wide or performative. It was gentle, welcoming, real. "I made tea," she said. "Thought we could sit on the sun porch. Rain sounds beautiful out there." I followed her through the house to a small glass-enclosed porch that overlooked her backyard. It was dim, lit only by soft lamps and the misty light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. There were cushions scattered across the floor, a woven throw draped across a chair, and the faint scent of jasmine from a candle burning nearby. We settled into the space, legs crossed, hands warming around mugs. The rain whispered around us, like a lullaby for grown-ups who had forgotten how to be still. "I've been thinking about what you said," Danielle began. "About waiting your whole life for permission. That stayed with me." I nodded slowly. It's strange how we do that, isn't it? How we silence our own voices because we think it's safer. She looked at me for a long moment. I grew up hiding parts of myself, not because anyone told me to, but because I was afraid they wouldn't understand. And that fear, it doesn't always go away just because we grow older. There was something in her voice that broke me a little, because I understood it deeply. "I hid after Mark died," I said. "Not on purpose, but in little ways. I stopped going to dinner parties. I let friendships fade. I became this quiet version of myself that didn't ask for much, just went through the motions." She reached for my hand again, and this time there was no hesitation in either of us. Our fingers intertwined easily, naturally, like they belonged that way. "You don't have to be quiet with me," she said. "Not here." I could feel tears welling, but I didn't pull away. I didn't hide. Instead, I told her things I hadn't told anyone in years, about the loneliness of being admired, but not known, about the ache of empty holidays, the nights when I spoke out loud to a photograph, just to feel less invisible. And she told me things too, about the women she loved but never introduced to her family, about the fear of being seen as too much, too bold, too different. We weren't confessing, we were connecting, stitching our stories together like patches in a shared quilt of experience. Eventually, the tea grew cold. The rain slowed, but neither of us moved. Danielle let go of my hand only to reach behind her, pulling a small photo album from a shelf. "I want to show you something," she said, echoing her words from the day before. She opened the album and flipped to a page near the back. There were photographs, old, warm-toned, clearly cherished. One showed her with a woman in her 20s, both smiling under a summer sun. There was joy in the picture, but also something wistful. "Her name was Elena," she said. "I loved her, but I let her go because I wasn't brave enough then." I looked at her, not with judgment, but with understanding. And she smiled. "I don't want to live like that anymore. Hiding, holding back." I reached out and closed the album gently, my hand resting over hers. "You're not the only one who's ready for something more." The words hung in the air like a promise. We didn't speak for a long time after that. We didn't need to. The silence was full of everything we'd both been missing. Truth, recognition, and the soft blooming of something new. When I finally stood to leave, the world outside had darkened into night. but inside something felt bright, alive. Danielle walked me to the door. She didn't kiss me, but she looked at me like she might someday. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid of that possibility. As I drove home, the reflection of streetlights gliding across my windshield, I realized something important. It wasn't just about Danielle. It was about me. About reclaiming parts of myself I had quietly tucked away. I wasn't chasing youth or romance. I was embracing presence, permission, and maybe, just maybe, love in a form I had never allowed myself to imagine before. The following weeks unfolded like pages from a journal I didn't know I was writing. Danielle and I didn't rush into anything. There were no dramatic declarations, no breathless moments stolen in dark corners. What grew between us was something deeper, layered and careful, like a well-tended garden finally given the sunlight it needed. At work, we kept things respectful, as always. But after hours, we gave ourselves room to breathe. Sometimes that meant long walks through the nearby arboretum, where we spoke about everything from childhood memories to regrets we still carried. Other times, it was simple, cooking together in her kitchen, sharing a laugh as we accidentally burned garlic bread, or listening to records on her old turntable, the crackle of vinyl filling the quiet between our words. It wasn't the kind of connection most people expected. We were an unlikely pair on the surface, me at 61, recently learning how to feel again, and her, just into her 40s, confident, inquisitive, carrying her own kind of sadness. But it worked, because it wasn't based on appearance or novelty. It was built on truth. And when you find that, age melts away. One evening, as spring finally started to stretch its fingers into the cold, Danielle invited me over again. I'd just finished pruning my garden earlier that day and still had the faint scent of lilac clinging to my sweater. She met me at the door with 2 glasses of white wine and a nervous smile. "I want to ask you something," she said. I stepped inside, raising an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." She chuckled and led me out to the porch, where the twilight painted everything in soft lavender and gold. We sat down, and I noticed she had lit candles around the space. Not romantic ones, just small tea lights, flickering gently in the breeze. "I've been thinking about this a lot," she began, her voice calm but thoughtful. "About you, about us, and how unexpected this all was." I nodded. "Tell me about it." She smiled. "I guess I want to know if this, what we found here, is something you want to keep exploring, without pressure, without expectations, just honesty." It was one of those moments where life narrows down to a single breath. A question not just about relationships, but about self-truth. Was I willing to continue choosing openness, vulnerability, change? I didn't need to think long. "Yes," I said, not because it's easy, but because I've never felt more like myself than I do when I'm with you. She reached across the small table and took my hand, her thumb brushing gently along the side of mine. The warmth of her touch wasn't electric. It was grounding, familiar, like coming home to something I'd long forgotten. That night, we stayed out on the porch until the candles burned low. She told me stories from her college years. I shared memories of raising my son, who now lived across the country. We cried a little, laughed a lot, and somewhere between her leaning her head on my shoulder and me lacing our fingers together without a word, I realized something. Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It doesn't always come rushing in with fireworks and fanfare. Sometimes it arrives like a gentle question, asked with care and answered with truth. In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle shifts within myself. I walked with a straighter spine. I started wearing lipstick again. I reconnected with an old friend I'd let drift away. And most importantly, I gave myself permission to feel joy again. Danielle and I never labeled what we were. We didn't need to. We were companions, kindreds. Two women who had lived very different lives, but arrived at the same place, with open hearts and steady hands. The office remained the same on the surface, but I carried something new with me now. A quiet confidence. A glow I didn't hide. People noticed. They'd say I looked more rested, lighter, and I suppose I was. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror in the women's lounge. For the first time in years, I really saw myself, not just the age in my eyes or the gray at my temples, but the woman I had become. Someone who had dared to step outside the lines, who had chosen to live, not just exist. As I walked out of the room, I passed Danielle in the hallway. She glanced at me with that same soft smile, the one that started all of this. And I smiled back, knowing that whatever came next, whether it was more nights under soft porch lights or unexpected turns down the road, I would face it fully, wholly, and without apology. Because I had been seen. Because I had allowed myself to be known. And because sometimes the most surprising chapters in life are the ones that begin when you finally said yes to your own heart.